Hello, my name is Michaël Green, and I welcome you to the ninth episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My guest today is Professor Owen Stanwood from Boston College. He is interested in colonial America and European endeavors overseas in the early modern period, as well as the Huguenots. And today, I will be talking to Professor Stanwood about his interest in history, how did he make his career, what choices did he have to make, and what motivated him throughout his academic life. I welcome Owen to my podcast. Hello, Owen, and welcome to my podcast. I am very happy to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Perhaps it would be a good idea to mention right away that we know each other for quite a few years, and I really like your latest book, The Global Refuge, Huguenots in an Age of Empire, which I found fascinating. Usually, the first question that I ask my invitees is about their childhood, because for me, as a historian who works also on topics of education, childhood is a formative stage of one's personality and one's life. And I would like to ask you about yours. Could you tell me a little bit, where did you grow up? What was your environment?
Yeah, of course. So I grew up, I'm from a small town in the far northwestern part of the United States, so just north of Seattle. I grew up on an island. The town had about 2,000 people in it. My father recently retired, taught English at a small community college, and my mother was a nurse. She's also retired as well. They still live there in the same town. So I think living in that town really uh, kind of made me interested in history very early on because the town was very self-conscious about its historical identity. It was a 19th century kind of small seaport town. So I became very interested in history early on, both local history, but also other places far away. We traveled a fair amount. I got to go to Europe when I was a child. So I think both of those things, that combination of the deep local history focus and being able to think about other places, kind of helped push me on this path a little bit.
Do you remember the first time that you thought, history sounds interesting?
Actually, I do, and it's a very funny story. So I was 6 years old, and I was on a trip with my parents to the East Coast of the United States. And a family friend gave me a present, and it was a book called History's Timelines, which was exactly as the title says. It was just a list of timelines. So it had like the ancient world, and then it was dates and all the important things that happened with like little stories and pictures about some of these events. And I remember my parents said, when they saw this present, they were like, this is the weirdest present to give a 6-year-old. Like, obviously, he's not going to like this. And I loved it. I spent years looking at that book and thinking about the dates and thinking about the people. And even today, like when I think about certain events, like the French Revolution in particular, they had some of the pictures of the guillotining of I think of the king and queen. And I still think of that book when I think about those events, even so many years later. And so that was definitely kind of my my first history moments that I remember.
You know, it reminds me a little bit of myself. I did not get a particular present that I remember, but my grandmother had a typing machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was 6 or 7 years old when I discovered the typing machine, and I was fascinated by the sound that it was making when you were typing on it. And I started going through the encyclopedia and typing down lists of kings from different periods, and I created a huge scroll with those kings, and actually still have that scroll somewhere
Oh
lying
well.
around. And when I was writing my master's thesis, it was the quickest way to check who was reigning when.
Mhm.
So quite funny,
You
yeah.
should frame it.
It's a huge scroll. I don't
Oh,
know how many
I guess.
pages. It's like a whole bunch of A4 pages glued together
Oh, wow.
by the 7-year-old me. Yeah. You said your father was teaching at the local college. What was he
Mhm.
teaching?
So he taught English was his and mostly writing, but he kind of ended up teaching everything because it was a very small college, and he was one of the few teachers there. So, even some of his classes would have historical content, or he'd teach about social science, or he also did a lot of interdisciplinary team taught courses. So certainly, I mean, he he only had a master's degree. It's a local college that didn't require PhDs, but he was and still is, very curious about everything. And I think that definitely rubbed off on me as well. That he was always willing to talk about history and those sorts of things with me. Even geography was my other great passion when I was a kid. I was just fascinated with other places and maps, and so certainly he was a good person to have conversations with about that stuff.
Were there many books in your house as a child?
Oh yes, lots and lots and lots of books. I mean, certainly not a lot of history books, but a few, but a lot of literature, and especially as I got a little bit older, I read much of it. We also had a set of encyclopedias, which was, less common now, but certainly back then was important. I spent a lot of time looking things up in that set of encyclopedias.
What was your favorite book as a child?
I mean, without a doubt, my favorite books were the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I From a very early age, I had them read to me by my mom, and then read them on my own, and which, in some ways, I think also helped push me towards history, because thinking about the history of that world, that imaginary world, I think gave me more curiosity about the real world. And we know Tolkien had lots of historical interests too.
That's true. And you went to local school, I suppose. And was there anything at school that you think could be also pushing you towards history? Because for me, for example, I never realized that history is something that could be studied until I went to secondary school. And our teacher, I think she was just a great teacher. She was so inspiring in the way that she was teaching that it was the first time that I realized that I not only like to read stories about history, but also I am becoming interested in history itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so my school, like I said, I lived in a very small town. It wasn't a high-powered school by any stretch of the imagination. There were 50 students in my class. Uh, but I was very fortunate in that
15.
50, 50.
Wow.
So very, very small. Um, but I was very fortunate in that there was a very dedicated history teacher in my high school, and he had gotten the school involved in a program called National History Day, which is so sort of like there's science fairs where students can do science projects and compete against each other. This was like that, but for history. So you could do your own research projects, and then you could either write a paper, you could have a display, or you could do basically a narrated slideshow. There were different things you could do. And I started doing this very, very early. And our school was quite good, even though we were small. We were routinely the best school in the state. If you won, you could go to the national competition in Washington, D.C. And I started doing this, and mostly on topics of local history. And that was so much like history classes were interesting to me, but doing my own projects was what really gave me a passion for history, because I could go to the library and find, I remember I did a project on a man named James Swan, who lived in the Pacific Northwest, and he worked with local Native Americans, and he kept a diary. And so I went and actually looked at his diary at the university library when I was 16 or so. And I didn't even really know how to use it as a source. But just the process of looking at it and thinking like, wow, I'm studying this guy and he actually wrote this with his own hand and now I'm holding it here. And I think that was a really formative moment too in making me think like, history is not just something that you kind of passively receive, but something that you can actively find out about and then disseminate to other people. So I think without having those experiences in high school, I'm not sure if I would have continued with it to the extent that I did.
And then you reached the end of high school and you had the option whether to study at all. But I assume if your father went to college, then probably he wanted you to continue in his footsteps. But what was your choice? Did you have several options that you could choose from, or you said that you want to study history?
I was pretty set on history, although I had other interests as well. I also loved literature, so that was a possibility. I liked social science. I was drawn to anthropology at certain points. But certainly, I think from the time I got to college to university level, I was very quickly pretty set on history because I took history classes. I went to a small liberal arts college in the Midwest called Grinnell College. And I had very good teachers there in history from the very beginning who I think pushed me very early to continue in that direction. So by the time I was certainly done with my first year in college, I was very much set on the history track. Mhm.
It's pretty interesting because people often think that if they study in a big university, a renowned university, then they have a lot more chances of success, that they get much better education than you get in a small place. But I think your example shows that that's actually not the case at all.
Mhm.
If you have the right teachers and if you are interested in being educated yourself.
No, that's absolutely true. And I was never I think partly because I was from such a small place, the idea of going to a huge university seemed overwhelming to me. So I always looked more at the small colleges, but we're very lucky in the United States to have a really excellent network of very small undergraduate only institutions, including the one I went to, but many, many others, which I think are relatively, I mean, I'm sure there's examples of that from other parts of the world, but I think they're relatively distinctive here in the US. And there certainly some of the professors at these places have wonderful research careers, but they tend to be very focused on teaching. Like you couldn't at Grinnell, my alma mater, you could not get tenure and advance there without being an excellent teacher. So almost without exception, they were great teachers there.
And then you finished your undergraduate studies and
Mhm.
you were probably thinking about what to do next. Was there a question what to do next, or was it already again set in your mind that, well, let's continue?
Well, I mean, there certainly was a question. I knew, I from midway through my 4 years, I knew I kind of wanted to get a PhD. And my senior year, I took a semester off campus at the Newberry Library in Chicago. There was a program there where you could go and do independent research at the library and write basically a senior thesis. And I loved that experience, and I got to meet other academics, and I really wanted to do it. But the main thing holding me back was that so many people, especially even some of my professors, were so discouraging about academia. And they said, "Do you really want to do this? It's very hard to get a job." So I kind of had this, almost crisis for a while where I thought, like, well, this is really what I feel like I want to do, but everyone's telling me I shouldn't do it. So I tried to think about other career options. Maybe I could be a journalist, maybe I could work in nonprofits. And then I kind of half-heartedly applied to graduate school. I actually took a year off. I went and got a job back at the Newberry Library where I had studied. And I applied to graduate school, but I only applied one place and I didn't get in. And at that point, I thought, okay, this is silly. Like clearly the world, the fates are telling me I should not have an academic career. I should try to find something else. And I worked in higher ed administration for a couple of years. But I just never could really imagine my life in that path. So I kind of tried to talk myself out of an academic career lots and lots of times. But when I thought about, what really makes me happy, what can I imagine spending my life doing, I couldn't really come up with anything else. So after a couple of years working, I thought, well, I'll try it again. I'll see what happens. If I don't get in, then that's the end. If I do get in, I'll give it a try. And maybe I'll get a PhD and I won't be able to get a job, and then I'll have to figure out something else. But might as well try it because this seems like I was what I want to do.
It sounds very similar to what I was doing because ever since my bachelor, I was working in university administration because I had to pay tuition, quite high tuition, and that was my means of paying for it. And at the end of my master's, when I asked Miriam Erdeni, who was my master thesis supervisor, what should I do next? Because for some reason it never really occurred to me that I should be doing a PhD. I didn't know anyone who was doing a PhD. So I thought, well, I still like it. And she told me, well, you should try to do a PhD. And then I said, that sounds that I should try. Yeah. Well, university, there are lots of people who go from academia to university administration, but I think many less go actually from administration into academia. So
yeah, that's
we are
true.
one of
And
the few exceptions.
my job was not high up in administration either. I worked for a consortium of small colleges, mostly working on off-campus study. So I would help
Me too.
administer off-campus study programs.
Me too. Exactly the off-campus programs.
It's funny.
Yep. But the fun part of it was the travel. I really enjoyed going and seeing places.
Yeah, I didn't get to do the travel. That was a disappointment. If they had been sending me around the world, I might have wanted to stay.
Different cities, different people, different religious communities, and for me it was interesting to be an outsider to see how it works from the outside. Right. But then you actually got a place at a university, at Northwestern University. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got this place?
It was I don't recommend my method to anyone else because it was sort of random. Over the years, I had thought about lots of different places to go to graduate school. And at first, when I was first applying, I thought of myself primarily as I wanted to be a specialist in Native American history. That was really my passion. I was also interested in the history of the American West, but more in later, maybe the 19th century, I think mostly. So I had looked into some programs in that. But over the years, I'd come to kind of realize that most of the more interesting work on Native American history was in the earlier period. So I thought, well, maybe and I had a very good teacher in colonial American history at Grinnell. So I thought, well, I'll try to move a little bit earlier. So I looked at a few different programs in that. One of which was Northwestern, which had their early Americanist was a historian named Timothy Breen. But it wasn't necessarily that high on my list. But I lived in Chicago. I, for personal reasons, didn't really want to move anywhere else. So I ended up just applying to Northwestern and to the University of Chicago, which were the two kind of local places that I would have been able to study for a PhD. I got into both, which was great. But the University of Chicago didn't give me any aid at all. So I would have had to pay their astronomical tuition. At Northwestern, I got a very nice stipend, so I wouldn't have to work outside the program. So it was clear, if I wanted to get the PhD, that was my one choice. So that's how I ended up at Northwestern. But it was a good, a very good place for me. It's at the time was is smaller than some programs. Like the University of Chicago at that time had quite a few students in the history program, but Northwestern had about 10 or 12 per year. So it was a relatively small cohort. And that was nice because we had much more access to the faculty than maybe people at some universities would have.
Maybe that's a point where I should ask you about some details on studying in the United States, because it's pretty different from studying in Europe.
So generally in American programs, at least in history, you start with a phase of coursework. And so those are dedicated courses aimed towards graduate students. Some of which, so at Northwestern, that would be a combination of courses, some that were kind of field courses, either large or just very small, a student or two. So, I took courses with my advisor, of course, in early American history, but I also took a course in early modern Britain, for example, in early modern France. And then we would also have thematic courses. So I took a course on, I think it was called Marx, Weber, Freud, and Foucault. So kind of a theory course around great thinkers. I took a political philosophy course offered by someone in the political science department. So we take usually for 2 years, you take a series of courses. At the end of that time, you complete field exams. And at Northwestern, those were mostly written. So my field exams were in, excuse me, American history overall, because that was my field, early America, and then a minor field, which was early modern Europe. And two of those were written. So you had to write, it was very daunting because you had like 5 pages and you had to cover, there was a big question about all the themes of American history, and you had to cover them in 5 pages. So that was a little bit tough. At other universities, like at the university I teach at now at Boston College, they're oral exams. So you might have a 30-minute, one-on-one, your professor asks you questions about the books on your reading list. And then once you finish your fields, that puts you at the point where you start working on the dissertation. So usually by about year 3, that's when you're starting to put together your proposal. So you write a usually 10 to 15 page paper laying out what you want to write your dissertation about, what kinds of sources you'll use, how that will fit in the historiography. And then at that point, you go off and do the research and writing of your dissertation for the rest of your time at the university.
How many years does it take altogether?
For me, it was 5, but I was quick. That's the average is 6 to 7. And some people take significantly longer than that. It depends a little bit on your field, because some fields obviously require you have to master a number of languages, you have to master paleography. Some people have to live for an extended period of time in another country where they're doing research. I was relatively fortunate in that my dissertation didn't require a lot of travel beyond the US. So I was able to write it up pretty quickly, but some people take quite some time.
What was the topic of your dissertation?
My topic was the era of the Glorious Revolution in the American colonies. So the later years of the 17th century. and particularly within that topic, the politics of religion. So I became it was an interesting journey when I got to Northwestern because I started off interested in Native Americans, and as I got kind of steeped in the sources of the late 17th century, I kind of went off on a sidetrack about religion because I noticed that so many of the sources were deeply anti-Catholic, that this sort of fear and hatred of Catholics seemed to be infused in everything, including relations with Native Americans. So they would uh, interpret uh, strife with natives in terms of, well, the Catholics must be controlling the natives and using them against us. So I became really fascinated with that, and ended up writing a dissertation that was really about how fears of Catholicism influenced a move towards empire in early America and in early British America. So from the kind of the move from the very disorganized early years of the 17th century towards a much more robust and centralized British Empire of the 18th century, I saw that change being in part driven by the politics of religion.
I just looked at your list of awards on your CV, which I found on your university page, and it's quite long already at an early stage.
Uh, I mean, I've done well, but actually of my cohort at Northwestern, many of my cohort have done quite well. So I can't really I can't really claim any sort of special place. It was a very good group, and many of them, I mean, I'd say I haven't counted it up in a while, but I'd say most of the people that were in either my year or the years surrounding me and at Northwestern have managed to find pretty good academic jobs. Actually, one of them, who was the year below me, is one of my colleagues at Boston College now, and she's also done very, very well. So I wouldn't put myself in a class.
And during your PhD studies, I think, well, during everyone's PhD studies, the supervisor plays an important,
Mhm.
or sometimes crucial role.
Yes.
How was it for you? Who was your supervisor, and how did your relationship go with that person?
Yeah, so my advisor was Timothy Breen, who was a very eminent historian of colonial and revolutionary America. He's most well known. Well, he's written a number of pretty well known books, but probably his most famous work is his work on consumption in the 18th century. So he wrote a book called The Marketplace of Revolution, which looked at kind of consumer links between Britain and America, and then kind of how that led to the boycott movements that then inspired the revolution. Um, he was known as a good advisor, known as being kind of a tough advisor who could be difficult to work with at times. At least that was his reputation. That wasn't the experience I had. He was always supportive of what I wanted to do, even though it was a little bit different from what he was working on at the time. I'd say the thing he taught me the most that I really appreciated was about writing. He was, I think, unlike a lot of graduate advisors, he really stressed um, that you need to know how to write, and you need to write in a clear and persuasive way. And I kind of thought I was a good writer when I got to graduate school. He quickly taught me that I wasn't particularly good. But I think I got much better over the course of him teaching me. He used to do an interesting thing in his graduate courses, which was he would almost never assign long papers. He would assign very, very short papers. And so we would write a lot of 1 and 2 page papers. And those were great exercises because they were usually based on sources. And we had to work very, very hard to get right to the point and be very exacting in your argument, because if you have only 2 pages, you can't waste any words at all. And I think I look back on those papers as being very important in teaching me how to write, because even in a book, that can be kind of the case. I think, we historians do sometimes have a tendency to ramble a little bit, and I've tried not to do that in my writing. I'm sure I've failed failed at certain times, but I think I really thank him for teaching me how to write.
By the time that you finished your PhD, did you already have a plan for the job? Did you have already an offer?
Well, I did get an offer right around the time my PhD was done, which was very lucky. Going into my last year of writing, I had an infant son at that time. He was born the July before my last year of graduate school. So I was obviously a little bit anxious about, trying to figure out a path. And I knew that the job market was tough, and I wasn't done with my PhD yet, but I thought, well, I'll apply to as much as I can and just see what happens. I was actually more hopeful of maybe finding some sort of a postdoc or something that a temporary position, that then I could get a couple of articles out and make a little bit more of a name for myself. I had gone to a few conferences. I had met a few people in the field, so I was starting, but I was still not very far along. So I sent off a bunch of applications, and I did all right. I got I think it was three. So back at that time in the United States, we don't do this anymore, but you would have 2 rounds of interviews for academic jobs. And the first round would be at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, which was in a different city every year, the first week of January. So you would go and you would have maybe a 30-minute or an hour-long interview. And then if they liked you, they would invite you for the on-campus interview a little bit later. So I had 3 preliminary interviews, which was not bad. And then I got an on-campus invitation relatively soon after that, which I was just thrilled about and kind of surprised, honestly. And that was at a place called the Catholic University of America. And so I went for an on-campus interview there, and I believe it was February, kind of as I was trying to finish writing up my dissertation.
Where is it
And
located?
It's in Washington, D.C. And much to my surprise, they offered me the job. So I found myself, in the position where I had to finish very, very fast. I still had a couple of chapters left to write of the dissertation, but and had to kind of rush to get those done in time so I could go and take the position in the fall.
Well, that probably lifted a lot of pressure off you once you had the job, so you got the motivation to finish your dissertation on time. As far as
Yeah.
I understand, American dissertations are not usually published as books, because when I look at your list of publications, there is no dissertation on it. But is there any rationale behind it? Now that you're a professor at the university, perhaps you could explain a little bit about it. Because, for
Yeah,
example,
yeah. So
in the Netherlands, we had to write a PhD, which was supposed to be published as a book. I think that's also the case for Germans, but in England, that's not the standard case, for example.
mhm. Yeah, it's similar but a little bit different here. So essentially, I mean, for most historians at least, uh, the dissertation is kind of considered a first draft of your first book. So the the assumption is that once you get to your first position, you'll use your first 7 years, 6, 7 years there to revise and expand your dissertation research into a book. It used to be like 20, 30 years ago, it would have been relatively common for at least people who were happy with their dissertations to just publish them straight off. But that virtually never happens anymore. So now it's just assumed that you'll change it, and that's what I did. So my first book, which is called The Empire Reformed, was essentially an expanded version of my dissertation. And I think I'm not quite sure how we got into this system, honestly. I think the assumption is that, dissertations are never kind of as complete as they should be, and there's always a little bit more work to do. I mean, certainly that was the case for me. I had finished it up so quickly that there was a lot of kind of unanswered questions that I felt like I needed to spend more time on. I ended up I had never done research outside of the United States before I got my PhD. So, and I realized that, my work was very transatlantic already. I was very well read in early modern British history in the historiography, but I knew I needed to go to England and actually read those sources. So that was the main difference, was I had a whole new body of sources that I used for the book.
If to come back to your career, you spent only 4 years in Washington, and then you were invited, or you moved to Boston College. Could you tell about that? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, Catholic was in many ways a great place to be. I liked the department a lot. Students were good. I it was I I had a number of reasons to want to move on. It's kind of a little bit of a odd place. It's a university run by the Council of Bishops of the Catholic Church in the United States. So very churchy in ways that I was not. It was also a small department. It did have a graduate program, and actually some very excellent grad students went there. But I was eager to move to a place that was a little bit bigger, a little less idiosyncratic. So I applied to a number of jobs in my fourth year because in general, it's considered easier to move if you don't have tenure, because after you have tenure, you're not eligible for many of the job openings in the United States anymore. So I thought, if I'm going to move, this is the time I should try. So I applied for a number of positions going into my fourth year there, and got a couple of interviews, and was a finalist actually at two places, at Boston College and at the University of Iowa, which was in the Midwest where I'd lived earlier. So even though Iowa's not high on most people's list of places they want to go, I was actually very enthusiastic about that one. But I came in second at Iowa. I didn't get that job, but I got the job at BC, which was kind of funny because one of the reasons I wanted to leave Catholic was because it was a Catholic institution, and I thought maybe I'd be more comfortable at a non-religious school. Boston College is also a Catholic institution, so it appeared that the places that wanted to hire me were all Catholic schools. But BC turned out to be a very different kind of Catholic school.
This is probably because of your interest in the Reformed Church.
I think so. Yeah, yeah, and in religious history more generally, both Catholic and BC are places that have strong religious history programs.
Your research is indeed concerned nowadays, well, at least the most recent book that you published, The Global Refuge, is about Huguenots. And here we are colleagues, since I'm also working on the Huguenots, at least to some extent. How did you come to the topic of Huguenots? Because you start with Native Americans, and
Yeah.
how did you end up working on the Huguenots, French Protestants, on the other side of the world? And you are doing transatlantic history, of course, but still, why the Huguenots?
Well, so many of my interests come out of things that I find in the archives that seem strange to me. And that, I think, is what brought me to Huguenots as well, that I was when I was doing my work on late 17th century America, I just found so many references to Huguenots. They seemed not necessarily actual Huguenots who were there, but people talking about events back in France, or that they're expecting refugees to come, or that they want refugees to come. And I found this curious because the main work on Huguenots in colonial America, which I had read, is John Butler's book called The Huguenots in America, which came out in the early 80s. And his thesis of the book is essentially that there were hardly any Huguenots in colonial America and that they disappeared quickly. So it's kind of a whole book arguing that the topic of the book is not really that important. And I just wondered, kind of there seems to be a story to tell there that hadn't been told. So I started, at first I was actually imagining a book about refugees in colonial America, not just French refugees, although they would be part of the story, but also there were a lot of Scottish refugees coming in at this time, and various kinds of English dissenters. But I still saw it as being a very colonial American project. Eventually, I started to think that this was too big. I wanted to look at the French Protestant angle, but then I was going to do a British Empire-wide project. So I was going to look at both Britain and Ireland and the colonies. Then I started to realize, as I read more, that the British Empire was not big enough for the project. I needed to include the Dutch colonies too, because that was an important part of the picture. So it became Huguenots in the Atlantic world. Of course, then I found that some Huguenots were actually leaving the Atlantic world. They were going to the Indian Ocean. So that's when it became the Global Refuge. It became kind of a study of Huguenots in overseas imperial projects writ large. So the project steadily got bigger and bigger and bigger.
I think it's a fascinating book. I've read it, and I can recommend everyone to take a look. That's how one should write history, at least in my opinion.
Well,
And I
thanks.
think this book was also very well received. You had a lecture at the Huguenot Society, which was, I think, quite a successful one. What are your plans now from
So
research perspective? What are you doing nowadays?
I'm working on a couple of things. I have one project that's still Huguenot related, and one that's not. The Huguenot related project is actually to write what's in some ways the prequel to the Global Refuge, which is about the 16th century. So I became very interested in Huguenot colonization especially in Florida in the 1560s. So the first really robust attempt to form a colony in North America by any European power, not just by the French. So from 1562 to 1565, there were several attempts by mostly Huguenots to start a colony where the city of Jacksonville, Florida is now. Eventually they were invaded and extinguished by the Spanish. And also the earlier French attempt to form a colony in Brazil, which had a lot of Huguenot involvement as well. So I don't know exactly what the project will look like now. I keep going back and forth on whether I want to write kind of a very narrow history of the Florida colony, or something a little bigger that's about kind of Huguenots in the French state and in their involvement in early colonization. But that's one of the things I've been working on. And I had a fellowship last year and was able to do a lot of reading, including some in France. So that was a lot of fun. And then the other project is actually bringing me a little bit back to my Western roots. I'm interested in basically European popular perceptions of what America was like from the 16th to the 18th century, the early 18th century. And a lot of their reports were of kind of fantastical wonders, of lost civilizations, of cities of gold, things like this. And this is particularly a French discourse. So I've been looking at all of these stories of kind of crazy mythical places in the Americas and trying to figure out what they mean. And what I've come to think is that this was really a way of a kind of storytelling that mixed native oral traditions with popular stories from early modern Europe. So that's another one of my kind of long-term projects. Both of these projects still have a long, long way to go, but I'm working towards them now.
And the other topic, I think it's still related to the Huguenots because who was writing all of those accounts. I assume that a lot of them were also Huguenots.
That's how I came across the topic too, was through Charles de Rochefort, who was a 17th century writer who kind of turned me on to this topic.
I would like to come back to your academic past, and maybe it would be a good moment to look back and reflect what was, in your opinion, the most determining factor in your success as an academic. Because I think we can call you a successful academic. You publish, you work, you are known in your field. You received quite a few prizes also after the ones that I mentioned, and even one you refused.
Oh.
Declined, as it said. It was the Franklin Research Grant in
Oh yeah.
American Philosophical Society.
Yeah, I turned it down because I had other grants that were covering the same. I couldn't accept everything, but that's not a problem I usually have. Um, honestly, the number one thing is luck, and I think that's true. That's been true in academia for years, and I think it may be even more true now. I mean, I have my own grad students now who I'm trying to help guide out into this world, and it's even harder now than it was then. And I think I this isn't to say I'm not proud of the work I've done. I think it's good work, but everybody does good work. There's hundreds and hundreds of really good scholars out there doing wonderful work, and some of them get great jobs and have great careers, and a lot of them just don't. And the way that the system is organized is not, it's not about meritocracy. It's often just about being at the right place at the right time. And when I went on the job market the first time and got that job at Catholic U, they just happened to be the kind of department that liked the kind of thing I was doing that year. And if they hadn't been there or they hadn't had a job right at that time, who knows what would have happened? I might have gotten nothing and been forced out of academia. And same with Boston College. I was able to move up to a better institution right at that particular moment. So I think that there's things that scholars can do to try and make themselves more marketable, including just working on topics that are trendy or popular, getting published, networking. I mean, all of that stuff is good, and I tell my students to do that. But without a little bit of luck, you're honestly not going to make it.
Do you think that publish or perish is still a vital thing in academia?
I mean, I certainly do think that you need to publish to make it. I don't think it may be a little bit different in the US than Europe. Like, we have moved really, I think, away from a lot of article publishing here. So I think having one or two is helpful when you go on the job market if you're a young scholar, but we're so book focused still that it's more about writing a brilliant popular book. And I think in Europe, maybe it's a little bit more about volume of publications than it is for us. I think it's more about your publications being in the right journals or in the right with the right presses and kind of getting more recognition.
I think that's true, at least in the field that I'm working. It seems that publishing a lot of articles is more important than publishing books.
Mm-hmm.
And some English colleagues don't publish books because they say that there is no reason for them to do so because it's not counted as
Mm-hmm.
much as 5 articles,
Right.
for
Yeah, we
example.
haven't moved in that direction here yet. I I honestly don't know. I feel like maybe we're a little too book focused. in the US because I mean articles can be really useful, especially for teaching, because our students, I think, are their attention spans for reading long things have gone way down. So having a very well argued, nuanced article can sometimes be a lot better for teaching than a long book, or even a short book. Mhm.
That's true. Well, I think that in your last sentences, you also gave advice for potential students, potential history students, potential graduates, potential those who are going to look for a job in academia. And the advice was that networking is important,
Mhm.
publication is important, and keep an eye on what is trendy. But I think one important thing is also to still remain true to yourself, because if you don't, then at some point you'll run out of energy and won't be able to do anything else.
Yeah,
I thank you very much for this really interesting conversation, and I hope that we meet again on some other occasion. Thank you very much.
you're very welcome. It was a pleasure.